The new discoveries here at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre happened during a recent restoration around the tomb of Jesus.
Scientists were never meant to investigate the ground beneath the traditional tomb of Jesus.
The decision to open the tomb was absolutely, unequivocally a group decision.
But when a routine structural check exposed a hidden section of the floor, the team had no choice but to look inside.
Our tour guide told us that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre new archaeological excavations at the site have revealed.
What they uncovered beneath the marble did not match any record, any expectation, or any approved history. It shocked the specialists who saw it first and pushed church authorities into immediate lockdown. The restoration that opened a forbidden layer. For decades, the custodians of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem avoided any major work beneath the tomb chamber. The area lies inside a tightly controlled section of the basilica, where every modification must be approved by the Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Armenian Apostolic communities under the long-standing status quo agreement. Because of these rules, the foundations remained largely untouched. Routine inspections usually ended with small surface repairs and nothing more. That pattern changed in 2022 when structural engineers noticed subtle shifts in the marble floor surrounding the edicule, the small shrine that encloses the traditional burial site of Jesus. At first, the irregularities seemed minor. Then deeper measurements revealed that parts of the floor were beginning to sink. According to internal assessments, some sections were resting on weakened fill that had compacted under nearly 2,000 years of construction layered on top of itself. The engineers warned that ignoring the problem could risk irreversible damage to one of the most sacred sites in Christianity. The warning forced the hands of the church custodians. Any change within the basilica required approval from multiple authorities, and these groups rarely agreed. Yet the situation left no room for delay. The Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, the Roman Catholic Custody, and the Armenian Apostolic Patriarchate finally reached a reluctant agreement. Scientific access would be granted, but only under strict supervision. Each group assigned representatives to monitor every action taken near the tomb. The atmosphere inside the church shifted. Technicians worked in silence, fully aware that they were entering a space that had been sealed to outsiders for generations. When archaeologists arrived, they were told their access would be limited. They would be allowed to examine only the area beneath the marble pavement close to the edicule. They had a narrow window of time and strict boundaries. Even so, the opportunity was rare. Modern science had never studied the deeper layers under this part of the floor. The team moved cautiously as they prepared equipment. They needed to avoid disturbing anything sacred while still gathering data that could stabilize the structure. Ground-penetrating radar was the first tool allowed into the space. The scanner hummed across the marble, sending signals into the layers below. The readings began to form patterns that surprised the technicians. The bedrock did not appear smooth or uniform. It showed dips and rises that did not match the expected layout beneath a stable foundation. According to preliminary reports, some of the echoes hinted at cavities or pockets that had been untouched for centuries. No one wanted to jump to conclusions, but the scans suggested that hidden features lay below the visible floor. Microarchaeology specialists prepared sampling instruments in case further investigation was approved. They had permission only to examine loose sediment and dust once the marble was lifted. Even that limited access offered a chance to study pollen, soil textures, and mineral deposits that might reveal the history of the ground beneath the shrine. When the first section of marble was finally removed, the team prepared themselves to see the usual repair material from past restorations. For centuries, the Holy Sepulchre had been patched, resurfaced, and reinforced, so finding modern mortar and construction debris would have made perfect sense. Instead, the moment the layer lifted, everyone stopped. Beneath the marble lay compacted soil that was far older than expected. It was dense, layered, and untouched by any recent work. The researchers understood immediately that this was not routine maintenance material. It was an ancient surface that had been sealed away under generations of rebuilding. What they had opened was not a repair zone. It was a direct doorway into the site's earliest history. Jerusalem's hidden stratigraphy. The team began removing the exposed layers carefully, expecting ordinary fill from different periods of repair. What they uncovered instead was a clear and orderly sequence of historical deposits. The topmost layer was easily recognized. Under the modern paving lay a 20th century leveling mortar used during earlier restoration work. It was a practical layer, but it showed how often the site had required attention. Beneath it emerged fragments of Byzantine paving from the 4th century. These stones came from the reconstruction ordered under Constantine, and confirmed that a formal sanctuary stood here long before medieval builders arrived. The next layer carried a heavier history. Crews reached compacted rubble associated with a 2nd century Roman project. Reports linked this debris to Hadrian's effort to impose a pagan temple at the site. The fill was dense and uniform, as if earlier structures had been flattened deliberately before new construction began. For many on the team, this matched expected historical accounts. The surprise emerged below the Roman layer. The soil shifted from construction debris to unmistakable quarry material. Fine dust, stone chips, and packing sediment pointed to active limestone extraction in the 1st century. Several pottery fragments found in this layer matched forms widely dated to the period before 70 CE. According to early analysis, this suggested the ground had been part of a working quarry rather than a simple open area. Ground-penetrating radar reinforced the finding. The subsurface layout sloped in a pattern consistent with quarry cuts documented elsewhere in Jerusalem. Geophysical specialists reported that the shape of the deposits reflected deliberate stone removal rather than natural erosion. For the first time, the area beneath the church began to resemble an industrial zone from early Jerusalem.
Took all these huge blocks and how they got them up to the surface in these ancient times with no machinery, no motors, only by human force.
Soil chemistry confirmed the order of events. Each cultural layer carried distinct mineral and organic signatures that had not mixed. This meant the site had remained stable for centuries, allowing the layers to survive in place. A final detail deepened the significance. The boundaries revealed by the GPR matched reconstructions of 1st century city limits. Some researchers believe this placement supports claims that the burial area originally lay outside the ancient walls. The idea remains debated, but it changed the direction of the investigation. With the historical layers identified, archaeologists turned to the soil beneath the Roman destruction layer. What they found there was unexpected and far more alive than stone. The buried garden soil. When the team reached the layer beneath the Roman debris, they expected more quarry dust and broken stone. Instead, they uncovered pockets of dark, enriched soil that did not belong in a quarry at all. The texture and color were completely different from the rocky material above it. This immediately raised questions because such soil appears only when people place garden earth intentionally in a location where nothing would grow on its own. The first major clue came from pollen analysis. The lab identified preserved grains from olive and grape plants. These were not wild species. They were the same plants that households in 1st century Jerusalem commonly cultivated in small managed gardens. According to several researchers, this was an important detail because gospel accounts specifically mention that the tomb was located inside a garden. The presence of cultivated plant pollen suggested that this area was not an abandoned quarry at that time. It had been an active garden space maintained by someone who lived nearby. The second major clue appeared when the soil was removed and the bedrock underneath became visible. Cut into the stone were shallow plant beds arranged in a simple, organized pattern. They were too intentional to be natural depressions. According to preliminary notes, these beds matched the layout of small garden plots often found near 1st century Jewish tombs, where families tended plants during visits. This pattern implied regular personal activity and suggested that the garden was part of a burial complex rather than a public field. These two findings changed the direction of the investigation. The soil proved that the ground above the next layer had been a maintained garden during the 1st century. The carved planting beds showed that someone cared for the space in a structured way. Together, they raised an unavoidable question. If a garden existed here at that exact time, what stood beneath it? The next excavation layer delivered the answer. The tomb benches beneath the garden. The first exposed surface was flat and shaped with deliberate precision. It was not a patch of natural stone or a rough extraction scar. It was a cut ledge. The moment the light fell on it, several archaeologists stepped forward. The ledge sat at a consistent height with a smooth surface that showed controlled workmanship. It was a burial bench, the same kind used in 1st century Jewish tombs throughout Jerusalem. In that period, burial benches served a specific purpose. Families placed the body on the bench immediately after death for washing, preparation, and the application of spices. The bench here followed that pattern closely. Its height, its surface finish, and its overall form matched examples cataloged in known 1st century tombs around the city. Nothing about it looked like a later addition. It belonged to the earliest stage of burial practice. As the trench widened, a second bench emerged beside the first. Soon after, a third came into view. All three carried the same chisel rhythm. The marks moved in controlled arcs that matched the work of trained stonecutters rather than general laborers. The benches formed a sequence that reflected planning rather than improvisation. According to field notes, their uniformity suggested that this chamber had been designed as part of a multi-person family tomb rather than a single burial. A new detail appeared when the team cleared rubble to the east. Beneath the debris was a narrow vertical shaft. The opening was small at first, but when the loose stone was removed, the feature became unmistakable. It was a coke, a long burial niche cut deep into the bedrock. These niches held the body after the initial preparation on the bench. The presence of both benches and a coke confirmed that the team was inside a complete burial system, not a partial structure or accidental cut. The workmanship gave more clarity. The tool marks that shaped the benches and the coke matched first-century carving techniques. The strikes showed consistent pressure and angle. Conservators inspected the chamber for signs of medieval alteration or later intrusion, but none appeared. The stone surfaces were original and showed no evidence of being reworked in later centuries. One feature stood out. On the west wall of the chamber, a niche had been started, but never finished. The carving stopped abruptly halfway through the cut. Some researchers believe this may point to a sudden halt in construction, possibly caused by an unexpected event or a rushed burial timeline. The idea remains speculative, but the incomplete niche supports the impression of activity carried out under pressure. By the time the chamber was fully revealed, the conclusion was clear. The garden above had not been symbolic or decorative. It had been part of a real first-century burial complex. The layout aligned with what the earliest accounts describe, and it suggested that the investigation was moving closer to its most critical layer. The next discovery came from inside the chamber itself, and it changed the tone of the entire excavation. The linen traces that should not exist. The moment the benches and the coke were fully documented, the next step was to examine the chamber floor and the small crevices carved into the stone. The tomb had been sealed beneath later construction for centuries, so the chances of any biological material surviving seemed extremely low. Even so, the technicians prepared their sample instruments carefully. They wanted to be certain that nothing was overlooked. The first unusual detail appeared when a narrow groove between two benches was vacuumed with a micro-extraction tube. At the bottom of the groove, trapped against the stone, was a cluster of tiny fibers. They were faint, nearly invisible, but they held a texture that did not match mineral dust. When the fibers were transferred into a sealed vial, one of the specialists paused. The material did not crumble like plant matter or sweep away like environmental debris. It clung to the tool in a way that suggested woven origin. Inside the lab, the fibers were examined under magnification. The images revealed a clear weave pattern, far finer than anything caused by natural processes. According to the first technical report, the fibers had the twisted structure of ancient linen. This created an immediate debate. Linen is fragile and degrades quickly in open environments. Finding it intact in any form inside a chamber this old was unexpected. The team double-checked the instruments to rule out contamination. The equipment tested clean. More samples were taken from the edges of the benches. In two separate spots, additional fibers appeared. They were similar in size and structure, and again, they showed the same woven characteristics. According to the analysts, the fibers were too consistent to be accidental or intrusive. Something textile-related had once rested on the stone surface. If this was burial linen, then the benches had not only been carved for preparation, but had actually been used. One sample carried an even stronger clue. Embedded within a fragment was a microscopic residue that indicated contact with oils, not modern oils. The signature resembled the chemical breakdown pattern associated with ancient burial ointments. Several researchers warned that the finding was still preliminary. They emphasized that further validation was needed. Even so, the lab noted that linen soaked with aromatic preparations was a known part of first-century Jewish burial rites. The possibility was difficult to ignore. The discovery carried emotional weight. The benches already proved the tomb was real. The coke showed that the structure followed established burial practice. But the fibers pushed the investigation beyond architecture. They hinted at an actual body that had once been prepared on these stones. For the first time, the evidence pointed to human presence rather than symbolic tradition. The team moved forward with new caution. If textile fragments had survived inside this chamber, then deeper biological traces might still be preserved. And those traces, if they existed, would appear in the sealed space that the radar had already identified below. The revelation beneath the tomb. The team had already exposed first-century tomb benches and traces of burial linen, but none of that compared to what waited beneath the limestone slab believed to mark the traditional location of Jesus' burial. Ground-penetrating radar specialists began their passes expecting ordinary bedrock. For several minutes, the readings stayed flat. Then the monitor produced a shape no one expected. A clean rectangular void sat directly beneath the slab. It had even edges and a consistent depth. It looked sealed and intentional. The technicians repeated the scan to rule out interference. The void appeared again, sharper than before. According to internal notes, the size matched a small room. Yet no historical map or document mentioned anything beneath this point. If a chamber existed here, it had been hidden for nearly 2,000 years. Because the slab could not be removed, the team searched for the smallest possible entry point. A natural fissure ran along the bedding stone. After long discussion, a micro camera was guided into the opening. The screen went black, then focused. The reaction inside the room was immediate. The chamber was intact. The floor was covered in undisturbed dust. The walls showed no signs of later repairs or intrusion. Nothing inside had been touched. The camera moved toward the center. A flat limestone bench stood in the room. It carried simple carved lines used in first-century burial preparation. These were not Christian symbols from later centuries. They matched the earliest phase of Jewish burial practice. The edges of the bench were sharp rather than worn, suggesting the surface had been used briefly and then sealed away. Through the small opening, the team extracted trace samples from the bench using vacuum tubing. Laboratory reports later confirmed microscopic fibers consistent with ancient linen. They were the same type of fibers previously found in the upper tomb benches, but here they were concentrated in a single place. According to several specialists, this indicated that a body wrapped in linen had once rested on the stone. The claim was cautious but serious. A small carved niche in the wall added another layer. It matched the shape of short-term preparation spaces used during first-century burial rituals. The niche was empty, except for a faint patch of discoloration, as if an object or vessel had once sat there before the chamber was sealed. Mineral buildup on the walls provided the final confirmation. Geochemical readings showed the crust had formed in a closed environment. There were no signs of movement, cracks, or later entry. If the analysis was correct, the chamber had been sealed soon after the 1st century and had never been opened since. The implications split the team. Some researchers argued that the chamber fit early descriptions of the original burial place of Jesus before later construction reshaped the site. Others insisted the evidence was not enough to make a direct identification. According to internal accounts, the debates became tense. A few scholars argued that if the chamber truly dated to the 1st century and held signs of a wrapped body placed briefly and then removed, it matched a timeline recorded in the Gospels. Opponents countered that this interpretation was premature and carried enormous consequences. The moment word of the chamber spread beyond the immediate team, the quiet of the excavation collapsed. Scientific committees, religious authorities, and international institutions demanded access. Heated exchanges broke out over ownership, interpretation, and control. And with that, the conflict surrounding the discovery began. The shockwave through archaeology. The moment news of the sealed chamber reached academic circles, the reaction was immediate and intense. Senior archaeologists were the first to respond, and many of them urged caution. They argued that the evidence, while extraordinary, required more verification before anyone tried to connect it to a specific historical figure. According to some of these scholars, the chamber could represent an elite 1st century burial space without necessarily confirming its association with the gospel narratives. Their calls for restraint were direct, but their uncertainty only fueled public fascination. Religious custodians reacted with concern of a different kind. They feared that unrestricted access would lead to misinterpretation or sensational claims. Several custodians insisted that only authorized specialists should examine the chamber, and they demanded limited entry until the evidence could be handled with proper oversight. They emphasized the sacred nature of the location and warned that careless presentation could cause confusion among believers. Their requests created tension with scientific teams who wanted open study. Historians who specialize in early Christianity took a firmer position. Many believed the discoveries supported traditions that had been dismissed by modern skeptics. According to several early Christian historians, the chamber aligned closely with descriptions preserved in the earliest sources. They argued that the physical evidence restored credibility to accounts that had long been treated as symbolic by a portion of the academic world. Their statements circulated widely and added fuel to the debate. Material scientists added another layer. They pointed to the composition of the sealing minerals inside the chamber. According to lab reports, the mineral crust showed a pattern consistent with 1st century formation. They emphasized that no later disturbance could be detected, which supported the idea that the chamber had remained closed since antiquity. Their findings strengthened the argument that the chamber was genuinely ancient. If you enjoyed watching this video, click the cards on the screen now.